Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Brisbane Writers Festival event. My name is Michaela Kalowski, and it's my great pleasure to be here this evening in conversation with Mark O'Connell, who is in Dublin. I wanted to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I am this evening, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I'd also like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land where the Brisbane Writers Festival home base is, the Yugara and Turrbal people, and on behalf of Brisbane Writers Festival, to pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. When you sit down to read a book about the end of the world, you don't expect to laugh so much, but that is the gift of Mark O'Connell's writing. While showing the many and varied ways that humans are obsessed with the end of days and their pretty significant disagreements about how and when the world might end, you will cry with laughter, you will snort at the weirdness of human thinking, and you'll also be knocked sideways by the poignancy and his insights. He meets people in the remote mountains of Scotland, in bunkers in South Dakota, and in bolt holes in New Zealand where tech billionaires are planning their end of days. But Notes from an Apocalypse may be the funniest and funnest time you'll ever have pondering the end of the world. Before we get going, I want to tell you a bit about Mark O'Connell. He is the author of To Be a Machine, which was awarded the 2018 Wellcome Book Prize and shortlisted for the Bale Gifford Prize for non-fiction. He's a contributor to the New York Times Magazine, Slate, and The Guardian. His latest book is Notes from an Apocalypse, a personal journey to the end of the world and back, and he lives in Dublin. Mark, welcome.
Hi, Michaela. Nice to be here in my spare room.
Yeah, would have been wonderful to do it in person, but maybe that we'll have to keep that for another year. I want to start by talking to you about apocalypse thinking. So as long as humans have been around, we've often thought about the end of things, not just death, but the end of everything. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about what your origins were with your kind of obsession with this topic.
Well, it didn't really start as a book about the apocalypse. It started way back in, I suppose, 2016. I wanted to write about the sort of like swirling, inchoate anxieties that I felt I was experiencing around things like climate change and just a sense of political fragmentation in the outside world and all these different kind of confusing things that were going on. And I wanted to find a way to pin those down in a sense and to find a way to write about them. And I started to get really into, out of a combination of, I think, personal unhealthy obsession and a kind of journalistic interest, started to get really into watching like prepper videos on YouTube. Sort of, guys, generally men, generally American men, who are obsessed with preparing for the apocalypse by, getting all this cool stuff together and, having bug out bags and digging shelters and so on. And I started to get really into this whole subculture, not as a participant, I should say, but as a kind of an observer. And it struck me around that time that the notion of people preparing for the apocalypse, the notion of the apocalypse itself, was in a general sense a way for people to organize their own anxieties around times of uncertainty and rapid change and a feeling of powerlessness. Historically and in the present as well, the apocalypse is something that kind of tends to come into view on the horizon at times of like rapid change and uncertainty. Yes. And it also struck me that this was a way for me to bring all these anxieties together. This was a subject. This was like, I had a kind of a topic for the book that I didn't have before, almost a kind of metaphor for all these anxieties and sort of uneases that I wanted to write about in myself and in the outside world as well. So that's kind of where the idea came from.
What struck me as interesting is that all the different people you meet, and I'm going to ask you to take us kind of on that tour of the kind of the weird, perverse places and people that you met. Maybe that's a bit mean, but what was interesting about them is that they all seemed to be, they all had a different view of what the end of the world meant. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, because I was surprised to hear that when I think about the end of the world, I think about all of us not existing at all. I think about a cataclysmic event like a nuclear event where everything's wiped. But you met people who are planning on surviving the end of the world.
Yeah. So that's one of the kind of interesting aspects of all of this is that, when we talk about the apocalypse, we're not necessarily talking about, an asteroid hitting the planet and everything just going black, People have different ideas about what they mean. And, just right now, the sort of strange events that we're living through at the moment, people reach for an apocalyptic register in their language when they talk about this, even though what we're really talking about is the end of the world as we have known it.
Yes.
Not the end of the world. Clearly, there's been a lot of death and unpleasantness and a lot of, change. But that's really the key thing, is that I think when people reach for the apocalypse, they're reaching for something to explain a mythology almost, to explain to themselves times of rapid change. But I think the thing that struck me quite early on was that in most cases, when people imagine the end of the world, they imagine it from their own sort of pre-existing ideological standpoint. So which isn't to say that, one version of the end of the world is any more true than any other, but when the anxieties that I was writing out of and sort of acting out of when I started to write this book and to do the reporting, really I was thinking about climate change. That was the big thing for me. And in another sense, the sort of political fragmentation and upheaval that seemed to me to have climate change as its kind of looming backdrop. But a lot of the people that I met, a lot of preppers are kind of coming from a right-wing perspective, and they tend to think about, things like nuclear war, mass civil unrest. All of these things are the kind of apocalyptic scenarios that they have in mind. The civilizational collapse, essentially. And there's a certain, I take I suppose a quite like distance and ironic standpoint to a lot of these people and their ideas. But I think for me the book grew out of a sense of, in a way, like a kernel of identification with the idea that civilization is quite fragile. Things can fall apart quite easily, and our civilization, the way that it's built, is very complex, and capitalism is inherently unstable, and so these anxieties seem to me to have some basis. So it's not purely a critique of these people. It's in a way the book was always conceived as a sort of project for me to find manifestations in the outside world of my own internal anxieties, which seems really narcissistic and probably is really narcissistic, but that seems to be how I work as a writer. I find almost in the way that a fiction writer, I suppose, I find ways to explore my themes, and often other people's anxieties are ways for me to sort of find antagonists and ways to explore my own kind of internal states and so on. So that's really what I thought I was up to in writing the book.
Well, you mentioned it already. I was going to say, if you were to put all these kinds of people on the couch, some of these preppers and other end of the world believers, how would we assess what was going on for them? And you've talked about it, that there's uncertainty and rapid change and fear of the future or fear of the present. But there's something that I noticed when you were talking about preppers. There's also a kind of a gendered aspect to a lot of the people you met who are preoccupied with the world ending, and maybe the world ending in it being a good way. It'll somehow restore them to a kind of a position. I wondered if you could talk about that. I noticed that in terms of the gendered aspect, a lot of them, the people you met and spoke to, or that you discovered who were interested in the end of the world, were men, and a lot of them are white men. Why is it an appealing proposition for them to imagine the end of the world coming?
Yeah, I think there are answers to this that the book tries to get to, and hopefully does in certain places get to. There are women and there are non-white men who are preppers, but by and large, the sort of scene tends to be very male, very white, and very conservative. And so I think there are reasons for that. I'm very critical of the preppers who I write about in the book. I see, the sort of key kind of line, I suppose, in that part of the book is that, you look at these people and their obsessive preparedness for the end of the world, and the kind of detailed, quite lurid kind of scenarios that they lay out for the kind of terrifying prospects that might happen. Mass civil unrest, cannibalism, all these kind of like
real lawlessness stuff.
Yeah. Like sort of Mad Max kind of territory, really. I mean, you don't.
Sorry about that. Yeah. Our contribution to end of the world vision. Mad Max. Yep.
It's all Mel Gibson. But you know what? I think what I started to see quite quickly was that, as horrifying as these scenarios were, there's something about the way that these people talk about these scenarios and the way that they obsessively detail them and obsessively kind of fetishize the ways in which they're going to prepare for them. You're not really looking at fear. I think what you're looking at, like below that and more fundamentally, is fantasy. And I think the fantasy has to do with power. It has to do with, you know, a group of people who perceive themselves to be losing their sort of cultural centrality and cultural prestige, you know, as a result of, I suppose, decades of, you know, civil rights achievements, feminism, all these things, you know. Conservative men see themselves as having lost their rightful position in society. And so what the apocalypse does, I think, is it provides a kind of like imaginative space where, not to sound too academic, but I think this is what we're really talking about, is it provides this kind of space of fantasy where they can imagine and play out their own return to power, to masculinity, whereby, you know, the state collapses. There's no protection from the state. There's no protection from community or civilization, and it's just them and their guns and their sort of know-how, and they're going to protect themselves and their family and their property against a kind of faceless enemy of, you know, marauders or, you know, people who are wanting to get into their fortified compound or whatever. And it's a fantasy that speaks to, I think, a fundamentally right-wing conservative view of the world. And this is what, you know, when I write about preppers, I tend to write about America. And you can see it playing out right now in the things that are going on in America, this kind of fantasy of, you know, a few good sort of, you know, sort of deputies sort of taking a stand and protecting businesses and properties against, you know, who only want to cause destruction and these kinds of purely ideological fantasies, I think. So that's all of what I wanted to explore when I was exploring this particular vision of the end of the world.
Mm. And as you say, they're deputies, but they're self-appointed. What's interesting when we meet, and I'm going to in a moment ask you about all the different places that you went to and the people you met, but when you meet some of the billionaires, for example, or one in particular who wanted to build, who's starting to build in New Zealand, the same kind of ideal, the same kind of politics seems to sort of be a thread through a lot of people who are attracted to this end of the world thing, which is this idea that it's anti-government, it's anti-intrusion. They want to make their own laws, they want to make their own rules, and they want to be able to sort of buy their way into that. So it's a fascinatingly and also quite terrifyingly unequal society or order that they envisage taking place if the end of the world comes and they're on top.
Yeah, I think, you know, there's a kind of a series of levels at work in the book in a way. There's a kind of lower level of the YouTube preppers who I write about first. And then, you know, I go to South Dakota where there's a sort of a vast compound being built of bunkers where, you know, there's a kind of a plan for a survival community that would have its own sort of private army that would defend the sort of inhabitants of this place against marauders and, you know, cannibals and, you know, whatever sort of, you know, lefty urban
journalists, people who write books, yeah.
European socialists, yeah. And then at the sort of higher level, you've got the sort of people like Peter Thiel buying up, you know, land in New Zealand, and that's the kind of. But the politics are on a continuum, I think, and there's a certain shared extreme libertarian vision of what a good society would be, and it's a very bleak sort of every man for himself kind of vision of the future, and that's sort of shared in all of these at all of these levels, I think, right up to sort of Mars colonization, which is of course a further level in the book. Mm. So yeah, and you know, I wanted to explore the ways in which the end of the world is exploited in a way for ideological purposes.
Well, let's stay with that for a moment in South Dakota. I mean, you talk about exploitation. You describe the bunkers in South Dakota as a logical extension of capitalism itself. You know, these kind of luxury real estate people who see an opportunity to sell people these bunkers just in case. How did you come across that organization who are carving off bits of land in South Dakota? And what does what does the bunker represent?
Well, I mean, I guess I came across it in the way that people come across everything these days, which is just, Google. And I think at the time there was a lot of stuff in, you'd come across like slideshows on Forbes.com or whatever of like luxury bunkers in various places. And it was kind of in the air at that time. This is sort of the early months of the Trump presidency, when the apocalypse seemed to be kind of trending, and there were all these kind of things in the sort of media atmosphere. But yeah, I just zeroed in on this one particular guy who seemed to be, he seemed to me to be a very interesting character, but he was building this apocalypse compound in South Dakota. I was very interested, not just in him as a character, but in the location. I mean, the book is really, as much as it's a book about people, it's a book about places. I wanted it to be a book about landscapes in a lot of ways. And this landscape where he's building this apocalyptic compound is just an extraordinary place. It's in the sort of deep prairies of South Dakota, like very, very remote, no people really, and this extraordinarily beautiful kind of prairie landscape, which seems to me to be the sort of like fantasy subconscious of American culture in a way. This kind of, the little house on the prairie and the
That's
sort
what
of
I was thinking.
all these kinds of things. And he's building this, as I said already, like a kind of a privatized state almost, and offering, privatized military protection to these people who buy into these bunkers. It was originally an American Army munitions facility that was built towards the end of the Second World War. And so there were all these, not bunkers as such actually, because they're overground, but sort of overground bunkers made from reinforced steel and concrete. And there's 550, I think, of these things spread out across a vast area of farmland, about the size, 3/4 the size of Manhattan, I think. So it's like pretty huge. And the idea is that people will buy, individuals, families will buy one of these bunkers and do it up to their own specifications. And you will eventually have a place where people can retreat to, kind of like a second home, almost like timeshare, where people can retreat to in the event of, well, whatever happens to come along, viral pandemic, nuclear strike, mass civil unrest, all of these things that are kind of like either happening at a sort of slightly lower level or already being threatened. So and it was a way for me to explore through the landscape as much as anything else these kind of apocalyptic fantasies.
You write beautifully about the idea of the bunker as being this kind of this inversion of the American dream, this escaping from community. Can you talk a little bit about that? I had not thought of bunkers in quite that way.
Yeah, well, I mean, there is I think a very distinct psychology in American culture to the idea of the bunker. I see it being kind of on a continuum connected with America is full of gated communities, and it's a very sort of famously, of course, individualistic society. And the bunker kind of acts as this nexus in a way of all these different kind of currents of American culture. There's the kind of the individualism where, you get into your bunker, you protect your own stuff. There's also a lot of fear, a lot of kind of fear of the other, and the bunker, like as an architecture, kind of feeds into that in a lot of ways. I think, since at least I suppose the Cold War, the bunker has like occupied this very distinct position in American culture. Just to see this place that is like in this like maximally American landscape, but with these like extraordinary extrusions from the landscape was like really evocative to me. And I do kind of verge into like almost nature writing, sort of apocalyptic nature writing at times in the book.
It works.
Thank you.
You call these reverse pilgrimages, which I thought was really great. And as I said in the intro, we've just talked about South Dakota, and you go to New Zealand. You also go to LA, where you visit this Mars Society conference, which we'll get to in a moment, and also to the Scottish Highlands, which I want to ask you about. But I wanted to come to New Zealand first because it's an extraordinarily beautiful place. You write in very, very amusing terms about how ravishing it is, and don't expect to go there if you aren't prepared to be ravished by aesthetic beauty at every turn. I laughed a lot and dropped the book laughing. But there's someone there there's an American who's been buying up land there. You mentioned before, Peter Thiel. Who is he, and what's the appeal for him and his view of what will happen at the end of the world and where he might put himself?
Well, Peter Thiel has become something of a kind of an antagonist for me over the course of my book writing career, at least. I've written 2 books now. The first book was, as you mentioned, the book about To Be a Machine is a book about transhumanism and people who are striving to find ways to expand the human condition and to live forever through technology. And Peter Thiel is kind of although I've never been in the same room as Peter Thiel, he's never agreed to speak to me or anything like that, but he is a kind of a sort of a Kurtz-like figure in my work, I think, in that he's always just around the next corner.
Lurking. Yeah.
Yeah. And so in this book, a lot of the sort of technologies and sort of wild transhumanist ideas and startups that I look at in the first book, those are funded by Thiel's money. He's a venture capitalist, essentially. He owns now a company called Parenthood, which is like a huge data mining sort of operation. And they have a lot of government contracts and so on. But his money initially came from, he was a founder of PayPal with Elon Musk. And an early investor in Facebook very early on. He was one of the first kind of big Silicon Valley figures to put money in Facebook. And he's still on the board of Facebook. But he is, how to put it delicately, like an intriguing figure politically. He has some really extreme kind of hard right political views, like some radical kind of extreme libertarian views about democracy, really. And he's spoken publicly on a number of occasions about how he feels that capitalism and democracy are no longer compatible, and he makes no secret of which of those two
he prefers.
He wants to survive. Yeah. So I've kind of been fascinated by him as a figure. I suppose as a figure through whom I can kind of explore my own anxieties about the future and my own kind of antagonism towards like extreme capitalism and so on. But so Thiel, quite famously, really, by the time I started to write about him, is someone who has explored like various sort of options for setting up his own kind of post-nation state sort of state. Like you mentioned seasteading, I think, early on.
Yes.
Seasteading, which is no longer quite so invested in, like literally or intellectually, but this is an idea that a bunch of kind of wealthy, it was quite popular in Silicon Valley maybe 8 or 10 years ago, but a bunch of like wealthy innovators would set up like a private island in international waters, build an actual sort of landscape out in international waters. That would
like
be
a
just
man-made island.
Man-made island, exactly. Yeah. Free of state interference, free of laws, free of taxation, and free of any kind of government regulation, where they could just innovate and create sort of wealth unimpeded by the state. So he's been kind of driven by this idea for quite a long time. And it became apparent that he, in I suppose 2017 maybe, 2016 I think, that he had designed on New Zealand, that he had bought like quite a large chunk of land in the South Island, and his kind of vision for this land was to build a compound where he could retreat to in the event of some kind of civilizational collapse event in the Northern Hemisphere, in America in particular. I got really intrigued by this. This sort of came along quite early when I was already writing the book. This kind of sort of started to arise in the news. And I wanted to go down there and see what there was to it, because there was all this speculation about, billionaires buying land in New Zealand, and New Zealand is a place where people could retreat to in the event of an apocalypse, and because there were all these, anxieties around the end of the world, particularly at this time, and of course there still are now in different ways. But I wanted to go down and sort of, as they say in the journalism racket, see for myself what was going on down there. And I initially wrote that part of the book as it was a Guardian long read, and it got a lot of readers. Like, it sort of went viral, and it was a strange thing because I wasn't sure what I'd found down there. I wasn't sure whether I had unearthed anything really concrete. I didn't see any compounds. I didn't meet face to face any billionaires who were buying up land. Secondhand, I talked to quite a few people and so on. But the reaction to it was pretty extreme. It was like, whoa, billionaires are buying land in New Zealand. The world, they know something we don't know. The world is ending. So I think the piece and the chapter that I expanded it into in the book is a little bit more. I think its claims are slightly vaguer than that, but I'm really exploring the perception that this is happening, and I think there's no doubt that Thiel, he certainly owns this land, and I went to the land, but it's a sheep station. Technically, I suppose, trespassed on this land, but it's just a bunch of fields. It's very beautiful because it's New Zealand. But that was New Zealand for me.
And one of the next places you take us in the book, is to Los Angeles, to a conference of the Mars Society. And these are people who think that, so there's all, as we've said, there are all these different views that you write about in the book of people who are either going to put themselves in a bunker or take themselves somewhere safe if there's a viral epidemic or some kind of cataclysmic, nuclear event. But then these guys are people who actually think that they might just leave Earth altogether. So they're talking about something else. What struck you about their rationale for getting off Earth and colonizing Mars? And how do they talk about colonizing Mars?
They talk about it in a way that struck me almost immediately as, well, first of all, nostalgic. There's a nostalgia there for a time in the sort of mid-20th century when the future was a realm of possibility and, technological kind of progress and, sort of a realm of like just infinite sort of prospects for kind of, crazy great stuff happening. That's gone now. I think when we talk about the future now, we talk about it in very uncertain, very quite dark and foreboding terms with some good reason, I think. But I was really struck by how these people want to reclaim that language and reclaim that sort of way of talking about the future. Also, I think when people talk about Mars, and this really interested me, I think, there's another way in which it's nostalgic, which is that they talk about Mars colonization. This is the terminology really that is at the center of this discussion. And growing out from that sort of notion of colonizing this other planet is a whole kind of realm of fantasies about reclaiming the colonial moment. And there's a really unself-conscious kind of lionization of that moment of American history. And this is something that it's very interesting to write about New Zealand, and obviously this is something that you know lots about in Australia as well, but the difference in the way that colonialism is talked about. Yes. Particularly sort of right-wing Americans tend to talk about the birth of those colonies and the expansion westward in this very nostalgic, very kind of dewy-eyed way. And Mars has become, I think, a kind of a blank sort of screen on which they're able to project the fantasies of returning to that colonial moment, which is sort of the birth of American capitalism and the birth of America's sense of itself as this kind of, grand democratic experiment. Of course, there's much darker things going on underneath that. So I wanted to sort of explore the ways in which Mars is a fantasy for a return to that moment.
You describe it brilliantly in the book when you say for them it's the future is the past.
Yeah, the future often in American culture is a way of reclaiming the past, reclaiming that language of expansion, the expansion westward, all of that stuff. I mean, it's almost, not quite, but it's almost explicit in places. I mean, they do talk about manifest destiny when they talk about, colonizing Mars. And so I thought that was really fascinating and sort of revealing. And I also thought that so the language around Mars colonization is often quite apocalyptic. It's often, we only have X amount of time left on Earth, whether it's, environmental destruction through climate change, or whether it's like an asteroid hitting the planet, or, further down the line, the sun is going to explode or whatever. Something's going to get... Yeah, if you throw enough stuff at the wall, something's going to stick. But it's like Mars becomes this kind of place where you can stage a rebirth of humanity and keep the species going. And this is the kind of bottom line for these people, that we need to become a multi-planetary species if we're going to survive, because something's going to happen to Earth. I mean, Elon Musk is a great proponent of this kind of language. Something's going to get us eventually, and we need to become multi-planetary as a species if we're going to survive. So I wanted to kind of examine that language and that thinking a little bit. And really what struck me is that, if you look at the conversation around the environment, this struck me as really strange and kind of inexplicable, that people would want to, rather than investing resources and time and thought into, solutions for our current predicament, whether they're technological or political or a combination of both, just sort of saying, no, we're going to rebuild on Mars. That seemed really interesting and sort of extraordinary to me, because if you look at the, images that are coming out of California right now, and obviously earlier this year in your own country, they were quite apocalyptic. And, a lot of the language was like, Australia looks like Mars right now. California looks like Mars or Venus right now. But no matter how bad it gets, I think, or no matter how bad it has got here right now because of climate change, it's nothing compared to the sort of extreme inhospitality to life of Mars. So I wanted to examine all these things and sort of find ways to link them to the current sort of anxieties around climate change, and also just a sense of sort of civilizational exhaustion. I think the idea of Mars colonization really grows out of that as well.
It's another moment in the book where you also explore how we think about who we are, how we think about being human. The idea of leaving Mars is actually of disconnecting ourselves from the planet that we emerged from.
Yeah, that's right. And in a way, my whole first book was about the desire to escape the human body and to kind of stage a kind of final divorce from nature. And this is in a way, a sort of further kind of stage of that sort of kind of fantasy. If I hadn't written an entire book about transhumanism, I probably would have included quite a bit about transhumanism in this book, because there is a kind of an apocalyptic sort of feel to a lot of that discourse as well.
In Allerdale Wilderness Reserve, which is in Scotland, in the Highlands, before you describe your experience being there, and it's a fascinating place for a couple of reasons, but you describe that reading the Lorax, the Dr. Seuss book, to your son as a kind of a preamble to thinking about why you want to go to Allerdale. For people who aren't familiar with the Lorax, you describe it as one of the most amazing post-apocalyptic children's books of all time, and people weren't aware of that. Tell us a little bit about the Lorax and the kinds of discussions it led to with your son.
Yeah, well, the Lorax is this just amazing. I'm just a huge fan of Dr. Seuss. For me, and it sounds glib, but for me, the great literary figures of my reading life have been Joyce, Beckett, maybe Annie Dillard, and Dr. Seuss. They're the sort of
That's
the
a
base. And I came to Dr. Seuss quite late. I read him a little bit as a kid, and he was read to me. But I started reading him in earnest with my son, and it's just so funny and bizarre and rich and linguistically playful. I always connect him in my mind with Joyce, that kind of pure exploration of language as a realm of possibility and play, and just unadulterated genius, I think. But the Lorax is a very different kind of book within his work, because it's very dark. It's incredibly dark and difficult actually to sort of read to a young child, because it's a story about environmental devastation. It was written in, I guess, the late 60s, early 70s, I think. I could be wrong. I think that period, around the time, I suppose after the publication of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, when like ecological destruction really started to be a discussion at like public policy level in the US. And it takes place in this kind of like blasted landscape where all natural life has been destroyed, and it's been destroyed by like over exploitation of the land for production. So it's a really anti-capitalist kind of propagandistic story in a way, just aimed at like 5-year-olds. And there was a lot of discussion when it came out around like, this is anti-American, this is anti-capitalist, this won't stand. But it is, I mean, it's a painful thing to read because it's a hopeful book. It ends on this note of like real hope where the child at the center of the book, who's always addressed as you. So the book is really addressed to the child you're reading to. The child is given some seeds and this instruction to plant the seeds, and nothing is going to get better unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot. That's kind of the last line of the book, and there's this sense that there can be a rebirth, there can be an ecological kind of rebirth, and we can reverse this devastation. But it's painful to read, I think, because it was written in it's like 40, 50 years ago now, and things have changed an awful lot since then. There are things that, Dr. Seuss didn't even know about when he was writing that book. And it's what I find sort of very poignant and very painful about it is that it places the burden of rebirth and regeneration on young children. And this is what we do, I think. This is what we're sort of doing right now. We're sort of placing our hope in the next generation. If you look at Greta Thunberg, that's a sort of manifestation of how, understandably and, quite poignantly, we place our hope for the future in younger people. So I wanted to explore that a little bit through the Lorax, and that's a theme that kind of runs through the book. There's a lot of stuff in the book about my own experience as a parent of very young children, and those combinations of like anxiety and guilt and hope that come from having children, I think, right now, and being aware of the sort of darkness of the future. So that's kind of really what impels the book. I think a lot of people, when they read it, were kind of like, why is there 15 pages about a Dr. Seuss book in the middle of this? Hopefully I pull it off. But it seems like crucial.
It is a crucial setup, and I have to say that the chapter on the Idyll Wilderness Reserve, which is called Under the Hide, was my favorite in the book. It's very beautiful and very funny. It's got everything you do so well is chunked into this chapter. Tell us about the people, though. They're called the they have a manifesto, the Dark Mountain Project. What's their manifesto? What's their view? How did you come to what did you discuss when you were there with them?
Well, I've been aware of the Dark Mountain Project for a while before I started writing this book. There's a really interesting English writer named Paul Kingsnorth who started this sort of movement, I guess it's like 12 or 13 years ago now. A former journalist, who's an environmental activist and writer, campaigner against deforestation and climate change and globalization and all those kind of protest movements in the sort of late 90s, early 2000s. And at a certain point around, I think, 2009, 2010, he started to get very disillusioned with the environmentalist movement, and particularly with discussions around things like sustainability and the idea that we could sort of get ourselves out of the problem of climate change through ethical consumption and so on. And he started to feel that climate change was just going to happen. There's no getting away from it. Nothing we do is going to get us. Yeah. So, which isn't to say that he's advocating for like just to hell with it, burn all the oil stocks or whatever. That's not what he's saying, but that we need to find new ways of thinking about the future and new ways of telling stories, new mythologies, new ways of creating art around the idea that our way of life is passing. That the way of life that's based on carbon consumption is on the way out. And so he started this with another writer named Dougal Hine, started this movement called the Dark Mountain Project, which is kind of predicated on this notion that the end of the world as we know it is coming. And we need to prepare ourselves for this. Not in the kind of like nihilistic sort of individualistic way of the preppers, and much more kind of, I think, left-wing, sort of hippie-ish kind of way, which is quite interesting to me. I mean, it's very controversial. A lot of people, a lot of environmentalists understandably got very angry with Kingsnorth in particular around the publication of this manifesto. But it's essentially...
Because it looked like they were sort of throwing up their hands and saying, we can't do anything.
Yeah, this is dangerous. This is a dangerous... Whether it's true or not is almost beside the point, because we need to... Maybe it's too late, maybe it's almost too late, but we need to do what we can in order to try and avert climate change. And, the Dark Mountain Project was sort of controversially predicated on the idea that we're not going to avert it. It's coming, we need to prepare. So this became like a significant movement in art and literature. And they, at the time, were holding sort of semi-regular kind of meetups and events and retreats in sort of wild places in the British Isles and around Europe. And almost before I really knew what I was doing with the book, I wanted to go on one of these retreats for reasons of like being quite fascinated by the Dark Mountain Project, but also in almost a completely separate way. I knew that I was writing about climate change and the destruction of nature, but I became aware that like I have no basis on which to really speak about nature because I have no relationship with nature. I'm a city person. I don't know anything about, I can't name a tree. I couldn't name a mushroom. I couldn't tell you what that bird is.
It wouldn't last. Yeah,
it certainly wouldn't last in Australia.
It's a very funny section of the book where you talk about, this is my comfort zone is having Japanese food delivered and craft beer. My comfort zone has very good Wi-Fi, and you talk about your relationship to nature as being one of kind of being in fear of nature, which is, as you say, is a kind of relationship. But you describe the landscape in this part of Scotland so beautifully, this extraordinary combination of colonization and industrial revolution that's, you describe at the beginning of the chapter, it used to be rich in oak trees and it's just been completely laid bare.
Yeah, it's this area of the Scottish Highlands called Allendale Wilderness Reserve, which was bought by a really wealthy English guy whose family's money came from flat pack furniture, essentially, sort of cheap furniture. And I guess, I don't write too much about him and I never met the guy, but he's an environmentalist, a nature lover, and he bought this huge chunk of like the Scottish Highlands in order to rewild it. So this was a part of the country where obviously most of the British Isles were covered in trees at a certain point, but this place was totally deforested in, I guess, like the Industrial Revolution kind of era, and even before the sort of early era of colonial expansion. All the trees were cut down to build ships, basically. So yeah, I got really fascinated with this, like, in a way, quite post-apocalyptic landscape, because very little lives there. I mean, there are still animals and they're trying to rewild it. They're also planting trees. They're trying to get it back to something like its natural sort of state. So this is where this retreat happened. And the sort of chapter builds towards my really like first sustained encounter with nature. So I was there for a whole week with a group of people, but the sort of premise of the week was that we would prepare to spend 24 hours in a spot of our own choosing, completely alone with no one else in sight, and just sitting in a single spot for 24 hours, doing nothing, nothing to read, no phone to look at, no walking around, just like, you draw a circle of sort of 10 meters around yourself in stones and sticks or whatever, and you stay. It's quite a ritualistic kind of thing. And I found that a little scary, a little intimidating. And a good chunk of the chapter is about the experience of just sitting, doing nothing, and, being intensely bored and sort of pushing through the boredom and, trying to have an encounter with nature, trying to have a profound experience, often failing, sometimes almost getting.
I particularly liked your sections where you were feeling as if you were a character in a Terrence Malick film, but then you were like trying to not be self-conscious of the fact that you might be a character in a Terrence Malick film, but you couldn't be that character because that character would never be so aware that they were in the film. It's very, very funny. And I think for a lot of people, even if you like nature or you've had some experience of nature, a lot of people who live in urban environments, I think will relate to it as well.
I thought a lot about when I was there. I mean, it's interesting to me that Ireland has not really produced nature writing. The great nature writers have tended to be, in my experience, English and American to some extent. But Ireland, despite its sort of association with rural kind of life, has not produced nature writers at the level of the UK. And I found that really interesting. And even right now, like the big boom that's happening in nature writing at the moment with people like Helen MacDonald and, Robert Macfarlane and even Kingsnorth himself, they're all very English. And the writing itself is very English. And there's a kind of a romantic attitude, I think, towards nature that obviously grows out of a tradition of romanticism in British writing. But it's absent more or less in Irish writing. It's not something I explore too much in the book, but I thought it was interesting that, I take this kind of quite distanced, sort of ironic attitude towards nature that I wanted to push through. I wanted to get to something beyond that. But I'm sure there's been lots of academic writing about, why Ireland has not produced nature writing. Possibly not. I don't know.
We have Australia, where people to write about Australia were people who came here often from England, and they were terrified of the landscape, especially when they went to the middle of Australia. There's this idea in Australian writing of the dead heart of Australia. And if you talk to people who live there or the traditional owners, there's nothing dead about it. But it was so frightening to people who came from England in particular. They say that their only way of feeling like they had a sense of belonging was to close their eyes, because it didn't resemble anything they knew. So it's fascinating about how those things shape our relationship to place.
Right.
Before we get to Chernobyl, because we have to get to Chernobyl as you did, I want to ask you about a woman you met when you were in that part of Scotland called Caroline, who was also on the retreat with you for that week. Throughout the whole book, it's a very good and powerful analysis and critique of capitalism. And you write a lot all the way through the book as you're going from place to place about your own self-consciousness, about how you're consuming, about flying, but about views on the fact that humans consume everywhere we go. We can't help ourselves. We consume objects and experiences. But Caroline said something that I wanted to ask you about. She said, our whole planet was Easter Island. And she was referring to, the remote volcanic island in Polynesia, famous for those amazing monumental statues that were built by the inhabitants, and then the whole place became uninhabitable. What did she mean when she said our whole planet was Easter Island?
This was part of a conversation, and I had so many conversations with Caroline. In a way, she's kind of the heart of the book in a sense, even though she's not on the page.
I felt that. Yeah.
Yeah. Like we've become quite good friends, and we're still in touch. Like a lot of the people who I met when I was writing the book, but Caroline in particular was like just a very intriguing and sort of deeply appealing person to me, because she just had this extraordinary way of expressing her own sort of deep anxieties, but which were also kind of mine, but she had a very different way of expressing them. And we had a lot of conversations about the time we're living through, and a sort of shared feeling of despair about the sort of continued environmental destruction and so on. And she at that point was talking about, she was telling me about something she'd read about Easter Island, which I think is a disputed theory, but this idea that like the environmental devastation that happened on that island had a lot to do with the building of the stones, of the heads, and that the sort of civilization had died out there because of the erosion of the environment, and all that had to do with like building the heads and like chopping down the trees to get them in position and all that kind of stuff. But whether or not it's true, which is I think like hotly disputed, I think like as a metaphor, she found it really powerful that like we are sort of worshipping these false gods in capitalism and consumerism, and we know that it's destroying us, and yet we're continuing on, blindly kind of pursuing these ends. And I think that was sort of her way of expressing the kind of horrified sort of fascination with what's going on at the moment. And yeah, she had a great way of just coming out with like very memorable lines. I often found myself, and I'd kind of joke about it with her, and find myself like having a conversation with her and sort of scurrying off to find a notebook. And
Very good. It's great to meet people like that on these trips. The last place you visited, or the last place you write about in the book, is Chernobyl in the Ukraine. What's it like inside the zone?
Um, I mean, it's pretty extraordinary. I mean, the reason I wanted to go there, I guess, in a similar way to Allendale, and wanting to, like, realizing that I had no sort of intimate experience of nature and wanting to sort of experience that. The reason for going to Chernobyl was, well, there's a few things, but first and foremost, I think, I'm writing about the apocalypse. I'm writing about the ways in which we fantasize the end of the world. And here's a place where you can see what the world might look like without people in it. So I wanted to see that for myself, but I also was fascinated by the way in which it's not apocalyptic. There's a lot of life there. The cleanup has been very successful. So it's not a place you would necessarily want to live, but it's a place where nature is thriving again. It's also a place where business is thriving again. And I was really fascinated by that, the way in which people find ways to make a living, and I didn't find myself being judgmental about it because, I'm a tourist in Chernobyl. That's really the only way you can legally get into Chernobyl. You can sneak in otherwise, but I'm not that kind of writer. But yeah, so, I bought a ticket, dragged a friend of mine along, went to Ukraine, went to Kiev, bought a ticket to go to the zone, and spent 2 days overnight visit to Chernobyl. And I visited purely as a tourist, as an apocalyptic tourist. So I wanted to write about the experience of sort of end of the world tourism as much as anything else, and also the sort of the history of, like, fascination with ruins and abandoned places. All of that kind of feeds into that.
You describe that area as Venice in reverse when you're talking about ruins, which I thought was very brilliant as well. And this, you describe Pripyat, which is the area where the zone is, as the graveyard of progress, the final resting place of the future, or one possible future. So all the way through the book, you're playing with this idea of our anxieties about the present and how we envisage the future from where we are now through those anxieties. Did seeing Chernobyl, that site, even with all the moss and animal life growing back now that humans aren't wandering around there as well, did it change how you think the world might end? Because it's also a terrifying vision of technology gone wrong.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing that really stayed with me about Chernobyl, is that, you can visit complexes of ruins in, Angkor Wat, or, Pompeii, or wherever it might be. And what you're looking at there is the ruin of a dead civilization in the past world. Whereas I think what's extraordinary and, for me, quite uncanny about Chernobyl is that this was a disaster that happened in my lifetime. I remember seeing stuff in the news about it, and, like, the devastating effects of it as a small child stayed with me. And, like, I guess a lot of people of sort of a rough age, it exists in this way, got under the skin of an entire generation. But I think what's extraordinary about it really is that it is so recent. And so you're wandering around this effectively complex of ruins, but it's recognizably the ruin of our own time. And so there's something really uncanny and strange and disturbing and fascinating about that. Because, I talk about walking into, like, the remains of an electronics store. And there are all these, like, smashed sort of electronics on the floor, like televisions, radios, computer keyboards, all that kind of stuff. And it's like, okay, it's old tech, but it's also recognizably of our time. And that sort of really makes you think, to put it in an extremely banal way. And so all of that, again, like, it's the chapter is largely about a place. There's stuff about people, for sure. There are characters who I got really fascinated with, and it's about me in a lot of ways as well. But it is about this place, this, like, extraordinary landscape.
The last thing I want to ask you about is, all throughout the book, we get a sense, you say it yourself, that you were a pessimist. You were somebody who was quite cynical. You'd sort of created this carapace of cynicism around yourself as an adult. But by the end of the book, you've sort of undergone a change, which that you write about very beautifully. You're not quite an optimist now, but how would you describe yourself?
Yeah, I'm certainly. I mean, I think I've left pessimism behind, for better or worse. I mean, there's part of me that still thinks pessimism is the most logical sort of approach to take to things, but in a purely coldly logical sort of point of view. But, I think, I probably was never as much of a pessimist as I imagined myself to be. The fact that I'm a writer at all, seems to suggest that there is something other than pessimism at work. This is something that people always say about, Beckett, for instance, or Schopenhauer. If you were a true pessimist, you wouldn't write a word. You wouldn't even open your mouth.
True.
What would be the point of art or any of these things? But I think, I sort of came to, in a way, the book is, as much as anything else, an encounter with my own pessimism about the future, my own pessimism about sort of life in general, an attempt to sort of grapple with that and find a way out of it. And I think, in a way, I sort of talked myself in and out of it, but ultimately I think out of it. Because it starts with this moment of like real despair about the future, this moment of like intense despair and guilt about having brought a child into the world. And so paradoxically, towards the end of writing the book, maybe 2/3 of the process of writing the book, and my wife and I had another child. And for whatever reason, my response to that was one of like overwhelming joy and renewal. And so I explore that a little bit in the book, the sort of paradox of, feeling guilt and despair about bringing a child into the world and then bringing another child into the world and having a sense of like, none of it's logical,
Well, you say that you write in the book that, parenthood radicalized you. For some people, it sort of, they edge right and they become more conservative. And for you, it had sort of the opposite effect.
Yeah, and I think, I don't think it is just me. I think that might be a generational thing, actually. I think, obviously the sort of, the standard of previous generations was that, you get older, you get a job, you have some property, you have children, and then all of a sudden you're Tory. That doesn't seem to be happening with my generation. And, I talk a little bit in the book with Anthony Burt, who's kind of my companion in the New Zealand chapter. And he had a very similar kind of experience of like going further and further left and more and more kind of staunchly anti-capitalist as a result, really, of having a child, because of seeing what this kind of ideology is doing to the world and the ways in which it's failing people and communities and, ecologies, and just feeling that it's not fit for purpose any longer, whether it ever was in the first place, and feeling that something has to change if we're going to make a livable world for children. And I think, there's a natural progress towards kind of a more radical position that, I wanted to explore that a little bit in the book as well.
And you did that really beautifully. Mike O'Connell, thank you very much. Congratulations on the book. I want everyone to read it. And thank you to everyone who's watched this evening's event with Mike O'Connell for Brisbane Writers Festival. I wanted to say that there are going to be lots more events coming up for Brisbane Writers Festival, so please make sure you check their website, and you can also donate as well if you feel like it. But for now, thank you all very much for being part of tonight's event.